and welcome to Centering Lived Experience, the methodology of away from home. We are so excited to have you here today. I am pleased to have some of my colleagues here. But before we get started, we're going to go ahead and allow a few more folks to go ahead and spend about 2 more minutes logging in as we wait for our folks to log into our new platform. We're so excited that we've already have about 70 folks tuned in. And today we're expecting about 300 folks to be able to tune in here with us. So we'll give folks just a couple minutes to tune in and then we'll get started. Okay, and we see folks rolling in. Alrighty. So welcome everyone. As I mentioned before, we were just letting folks roll in. It looks like we have a new wave of folks who have joined us. So I'm going to kick it off to Sarah Fatala, who is going to open us up here, and we will take it from there.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to discuss a bit more about the behind the scenes of Away from Home, the study that we recently published on youth experiences of institutional placements in foster care, with a particular focus on methodology and how we centered lived experience throughout the research process. So before I get started, I just want to introduce the lovely people that you see around in the screen. So we have Sarah Sullivan, the other Sarah, who is a project lead on this project, as well as Sixto, whom you've heard just now, and Bobby, who are also a part of the research team. Okay, let's dive right in. So to quickly recap, the study began in September 2020. I can't believe it's been a year already. And the purpose of the project was to understand the experiences, mental models, and opinions of young people in recent experience living in institutional placements in foster care in the US. Think of Us led a team of 7 people who conducted this study, which included teammates from Think of Us, like the ones that I've introduced, NE, Casey Foundation, and Casey Family Program. And this project culminated with Away from Home, Youth Experiences of Institutional Placements in Foster Care, a report and book that was authored by Think of Us and launched in July 2021. And just to be explicit about the terminology that we use, institutional placements here for us means all kinds of out-of-home, non-family, live-in foster care placements. So this includes congregate placements like group homes or non-clinical residential homes. It includes homes for pregnant and parenting teens, transitional and emergency shelters, and other out-of-home placements such as assessment centers or other similar settings. So it was very important for us as a team to center lived experience from beginning to end. And to that end, we drew from the work of anti-oppressive research, feminist research, Indigenous research, activist and militant research, and other research justice frameworks that critique the structural inequities typically reproduced in research. And we also looked at literature around trauma-informed care to center healing in this process. So we took this process and we broke it down somewhat chronologically into 8 steps, which we'll explore one by one. So let's dive right in. The first step is how we scoped the study and formed the team. In forming the project team, we had 6 teammates that had experience in child welfare. 3 had experience being in foster care, and 2 had experience specifically living in institutional placements. We had teammates from 3 organizations, like I mentioned, Think of Us, the NE, Casey Foundation, Casey Family Programs, to make it a cross-organization project. What's important about this is that the team members that we had with lived experience were crucial in scoping what we call the lines of inquiry. So the research topics and questions that we went into it with the study and helped us really frame those research questions. So this is some of the points that we landed on as far as our research topics were concerned. I'm not going to go through them in detail, and you can learn more about them in the report. But while this is on screen, I'd love to pause here and invite any of my colleagues to add anything before we move to the next section.
I'll add, this is Sarah Sullivan. I'll add that one of the elements we were most proud of, I think, of how we centered lived experience in this project is how we actually we built out the team to center lived experience. So as Sarah said, 3 of the 7 teammates actually had lived experience in foster care themselves. And of those 3, 2 had lived experience in group homes and foster care specifically. And I think there were several critical moments in the project where because we made that decision, the project, I think, was superior because of that decision. And so I can't really overstate how important of a decision I really think that was. And to the point about scoping, Six Toes brought this up many times, that this concept to do this project, basically as early as the concept came to be, Six Toe made sure we put that concept right in front of people with lived experience to say, what is your reaction to the entire framing of this project, so that we actually frame it from the get-go in the right way, or in a way that's most aligned with what would make sense to folks with lived experience. And I think those early decisions to center lived experience right away helped shape the direction of the project overall.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sarah. So then let's look at the next step, which is how we design and plan the research. We chose to rely on 2 qualitative research methods, interviews and what we call cultural probes. Cultural probes are sort of invitations to share sort of more affective or emotional responses to specific prompts. And these 2 methods were chosen to really make sure that we can allow participants to share their stories in a way that felt most comfortable to them. So verbally during the interviews, but we also had prompts that they could respond to in writing, through art like photography or drawings or collages, and they could do so synchronously in interviews or asynchronously through the cultural probes. Anticipating the sensitive nature of the topics that would be discussed, we also provided referral paths to life-affirming services and additional resources like food and housing resources. And we had a resident clinical supervisor on hand for any questions or anything that might arise during the research. It was also important for us to protect the privacy of participants, which is why all research data that was collected was anonymized and all identifying information was removed. We attributed each participant a code that allowed the team to scrub sensitive and identifying information while still being able to accurately reference research data and provide useful context to the reader. So this was the table that showed the nomenclature for the codes that we assigned to research participants. And so it gave a little bit of context around their experiences without revealing their identity. So each code had the participant's type of institutional placement, the amount of time they spent in those placements, and then the state where they were located. Lastly, we also drew from trainings on trauma and trauma-informed care so that we could conduct a training for the entire team to be able to recognize what we call affect changes in participants, particularly given the remote nature of the interviews, which makes it harder to read nonverbal cues and cues that would tell us if there's any sort of discomfort or distress or just changes in affect. Again, I'd like to pause here and invite colleagues if they want to add anything before we move to the next step of the process.
Bobby, if you're going to jump in, if not, I just want to go ahead and just highlight that one of the things that really stuck out for me was the fact that we brought this method into this research study because we were really, being observant and aware of that sharing some of the experiences that we had in group homes was sharing some of the most traumatic experiences that young people had. And so we wanted to be very sensitive to providing different methods in which young people can give us insight for the study, and yet respect the fact that this is probably some of the most traumatic experiences that young people had had. And the reason that we knew that was because the lived experience folks who were on the day-to-day execution of this team had been able to see that within their peers, had some experiences. So the level of the method was also trying to meet the level of trauma and where it was specific, the intensity of those experiences there. Bobby, I don't know if you had a point that you wanted to bring up too.
Yeah, I think really just the diverse population and getting so many young people across the country to kind of go through a different type of research where they were able to provide some art, some different kind of poetry, right? Have that creativity brought out, because information just isn't translated through verbiage or interviews. It's also translated through feelings and artistic expression. And so giving that opportunity, I think, really enhanced what we learned, but also what we were able to share to people across the country.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sixto and Bobby. And what I'll add here that sort of touches upon the previous step around framing the research questions and why it was important to have people with lived experience in the team is that as we were formulating the kinds of questions in our interview guide, they were also able to say, the way that we're asking this question is not the right way to go about it. Like, this may be triggering, or this might cause confusion or distress. So being trauma-informed also transpired in the way that we were making those asks, whether they were interview questions or the cultural probe prompts. So then let's move on to the third step, which is participant recruiting. We organized recruiting of participants through open channels rather than through organizations, so that we don't just narrow ourselves and get what is typically known in research as the usual suspects, so people who participate in a lot of research, to avoid research fatigue and also bias. The recruitment calls used plain language and were clear about expectations of how many people were going to participate and on which basis they were going to be selected. And given that we received a lot more interest from people than we had the capacity to take on as participants, we created and published a transparency memo video around the recruiting process. And we explained why some people were selected and others were not by walking them through the study's sampling process. So this is a screenshot of our screener, which included in plain language the scope of the research, expectations around selection criteria, the time required, compensation, and how many participants would be chosen. And this is the transparency memo video that we published on the same channels we posted our recruitment calls after selecting the research participants. Oh, sorry. Do you want to jump in right now before I talk about intersectionality?
No, go ahead. Sorry, I thought you were done.
Well, you're fine. It's worth noting that we also wanted to make sure that the lived experience we centered covered a wide range of experiences, because no two people went through institutional placements the same way. And our sampling criteria aim to include factors that would play a significant role in someone's experience while in foster care. So that included race, gender, sexual orientation, geographic location, but also the number of placements that they had, their perceived experiences in those placements, whether they felt they were good or bad, the placement type, and more. So this is a quick look at our sampling table, which was complicated to say the least, given that we had 11 sampling criteria to work with. And again, I'd like to pause here and invite maybe Sixto to add anything before we move on.
Thank you for that. Sorry, I was got excited there. One of the things I just wanted to point out was that the power of being able to post it on social media, being able to recruit specifically folks who and post it within Facebook groups that were groups like Foster Care Alumni of America, the Jim Casey Youth Opportunity Initiative Fellows, and then at large other groups too. really helped create the opportunity for us to be able to get 276 folks that were interested. And so by having that very clear form, by posting it on social media, and then being able to, to be able to go ahead and have it live up there for 24 hours, what we were able to find is that young people were able to make a quick choice about whether they wanted to participate. And then once we realized we had so many of folks, we really felt like it was important not to just say, hey, you haven't been selected for this opportunity. And because, and what we were trying to center was the fact that too many times we get told no when we have, in certain experiences, but without the actual explanation. And so we knew that folks actually had taken the time to thoroughly fill this out. And so we wanted to go back to them. And then we walked for 10 minutes about how the selection process and what methodology we used in the selection. And really what we heard was a deep appreciation for young people about how it was concluded. And they felt that we had valued their time by making that feedback loop. And so I wanted to stress that because I feel like a lot of times in studies, we may or may not circle back to people. And so what we're finding is that one of the secret sauce here for people to feel good, even if they're not chosen, is to loop back at this point and many other points.
Absolutely. The key word here was really transparency and being able to, again, undo or minimize the unjust control that young people face regularly in the system. Moving on to our fourth step, which is onboarding participants. This is not a term that is used in research, really, that this just means what we did before. So between the selection of research participants until the research sessions themselves. For scheduling interviews, the team involved members of the research team in recruiting and scheduling as early on as possible so that we can start building relationships with young people, which is very important, as opposed to, say, hiring an external entity that would do the recruiting on our behalf. We also had a dedicated research coordinator checking in with participants before, on the day of, during, and after the research, so that they would make sure that people felt comfortable and had the support that they needed to share their story if they chose to do so. This was just a screenshot of the emails that we sent to participants that were selected to schedule interviews. And again, it was very important for us that everything was clear up front. What was the ask in terms of time? What was the benefit in terms of stipend and compensation? And also making sure again and again that we would follow up and that we would be mindful of that follow-up and really do so. In terms of informed consent, we wanted to make sure that participants really understood the risks and benefits of participating in the study. For that reason, we framed the informed consent process using the language of a Bill of Rights, which youth in foster care are familiar with and know that they can enforce. We kept this Bill of Rights fairly succinct. It was 2 pages long, but this is some of the language we had up front. And again, I would like to invite any of my colleagues, and I think Bobby maybe had something that she wanted to share on this.
Yeah, I think it was really important that we centered lived experience by, really centering participants' experience with empowerment and compassion, right? So we're empowering them to be in the driver's seat, right? To opt out at any time, to have the freedom to kind of conduct the interview in whatever way, which meant either with the camera on or with the camera off, right? We really gave them a lot of flexibility and freedom because they were in the driver's seat. But we also were compassionate and we acknowledged that this is not easy, right? This is not easy to relive. This is not easy to ask these hard questions, right? So we're compassionate and we wanted to center that. And so I think that opt-out option and just the transparency and the informed consent really allowed participants to feel comfortable to be in space with us, to be in community with us, and to really give their authentic and transparent experiences with this research.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Bobby. And we'll touch again on some of this flexibility, and how we wanted really to provide youth with opportunities to make choices for themselves, not just at this step, but also in the following steps in the research process. So let's talk about conducting the research and the research sessions themselves. Our main goal was to make sure that we provided people with agency and opportunities to make choices for themselves, so that we, again, we were not replicating the unjust control that they were subjected to in the system. So we offered multiple ways for people to engage, whether it was an interview or the cultural probes, whichever felt more comfortable, private, safe, or other things that they valued. If video conferencing was being used, they were allowed to choose whether they wanted to have their video on and off, both for themselves as well as for us as the research team. We really wanted to make sure that we provided them with opportunities for refusal throughout the interviews, meaning they could at any point in time say no or refuse to talk about a topic without any repercussions on their compensation. So the way we did that is that we would state upfront at the beginning of an interview, for example, these are the topics that we would be covering. And then we would preface each transition to another topic to check in again whether they wanted to talk about that topic or not. And when it comes to the cultural probe, we gave them the opportunity to choose between 5 of them and do as little as many as they wanted. So some chose to just do 1, some chose to do all 5, or a number in between. So this is just an example of a research participant who chose to join the the interview via video and insisted on having their video off. And these are the 5 cultural probes, which we called exercises, just to remove the jargon that people could choose from. We were also mindful of some of the potentially distressing and uncomfortable things that may arise during research sessions. So we established a protocol that included, if we noticed something, acknowledging and naming that it was happening rather than ignoring it. And only if the participant were willing to share. It was very important to validate the veracity of what they were feeling without interrogating, without voicing any doubts, without minimizing their emotions, without saying anything like, it's okay, without saying anything like, you will feel better later, but really just affirming in the way that they were describing their experience, and making sure that they were hearing an affirmation rather than doubts or interrogation. We also offered, if that happened, options for how to move forward, whether that was stopping the interview altogether, skipping the question, skipping that whole section, taking a break, drinking some water, or doing any kind of grounding activities that we had on hand. And we also wanted to make sure that participants knew that they were in control and they could decide on next steps. So the options that we provided were definitely up to them to choose from, and not something that we sort of decided on their behalf. And in continuation of that, when wrapping research session, and again, this was something that was suggested by members of the team that were very wise to make sure that we included that, we took the time to emphasize and affirm participants' strengths during the research sessions, especially given that a lot of what they were disclosing was fairly revolved around issues that they've had during those institutional placements. So we wanted to end on a more affirming note. And also we discussed ways to follow up and check in with them after the research session if they wanted to, including if we talked about providing resources and followed up on that. Lastly, when it comes to the power differentials that exist between a researcher and a participant, we know that there are different power dynamics that stem from the difference in positionality. We wanted to prioritize team members that had affinity to the young people we engage with, and that were holding those relationships, that were leading the interviews, that were tracking the participants' affects, while others were taking notes, manning the technology, and managing other logistics. Speaking of team members, I'm not sure if any of y'all wanted to add anything before I move to the next section.
I'll jump in and I'll say that this is actually where we really would love to see more folks apply some of the things that we were conscious of. Number one, we were conscious of that, those of us who've had lived experience in the system have lived under a dynamic where we always had to answer the question right. Because if we did not answer the question right, it had a lot of different types of consequences, whether that meant removal, whether that meant you're in a program, you're not in a program, redo the paperwork, not do the paperwork. And so we walked into this knowing that, there might be folks who really feel like they have to say the right things. And so we emphasize the Bill of Rights to switch up the power dynamics. We emphasize and we're intentional and many times in the interviews to say, hey, we can stop here or we can pivot or we can talk about other things so that the folks knew that they were in charge of where this conversation was going and that power dynamic wasn't one where it was like, please complete this assignment so that you can get paid. And so that level of care, making sure we attempted to try to even Uber Eats folks food beforehand. We attempted to treat folks who were part of the interview just as we do our major donors. And I think this is the most important, one of the most important pieces in terms of framework, which is that when someone donates to your organization or you have a funder, you treat them like gold. And so this is not something that you haven't done before. All we have to do is apply the same principles and the same type of cultivation and the same things that we would do for our donors who would cut $1 million check and just do it with our young people. And so that means making things super easy. That means being very clear about the ask, being very clear about what the impact of your ask, right? These are the same principles that we use in fundraising and so forth. And so for us, as we were thinking about centering as much as possible to make this not just an experience that's trauma-informed, but also that's healing, and also that every participant knows that they were valued, and it was not just valued because we wanted to extract something, but that because they could actually go ahead and contribute something and push that something forward.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Sixto. And speaking of one of the principles of trauma, being trauma-informed and centering healing, is safety. And so we sort of considered in the back of our mind safety at 3 levels. We have safety in the self, so making sure that they were comfortable, that they were compensated, that their opinions were valued. Safety in the environment, so again, being in a space that they felt comfortable with, whether that was on video, off video, etc. But also safety in what we call the relational frame, so in that relationship that they hold between themselves and the researcher, power dynamics, the way that they were in the driver's seat, etc., etc. So now we are going to get to the 6th step, which is compensating participants. It's one that I feel very strongly about, so I'm really excited that we're talking about it today. It was very important for us to make sure that the research process was not as extractive. And I've been doing research for the last decade, and I can tell you that this was a project that I felt sort of the most comfortable around the thought process that we had for compensation and making sure that we were valuing participants' time and insights. So we compensating young people on par with team members for the interviews. The team compensated those with lived experience at a rate of about $130 per hour for interviews. And we just wanted to value lived experience as much as process or subject matter expertise. We viewed the value of a researcher, the value of someone who is an expert of child welfare in the same way that we would value the insights of someone with lived experience. And in addition to participating in the research, whether through interviewing or cultural probe, we compensated participants every single time that they gave us their time and wisdom. So whether that was through completing the participant review, which we'll talk about later, or reacting to the national readout presentation, which we'll also touch upon later in a little bit. In addition to material compensation, we wanted to share knowledge. For example, when we relied on specific tech platforms like Miro, if you know that, we offered to scale up young people on how to use them, both live and during optional office hours. Lastly, after writing the first draft of the research report, the team went back to each young person who contributed a digital cultural probe artifact, whether that was a poem, a drawing, a photograph, etc., with the opportunity for them to credit their work publicly, since it was going to be published in a book, and something that they could include in their resumes or something else. Again, with some disclosure around the risks of having your name be shown publicly, but that was an informed risk that they were willing to take if they chose to do so. And lastly, when the project was wrapped up, participants received a token of appreciation, which included a detailed letter outlining what had changed in the ecosystem as a result of the publication of the project, and a framed certificate that commemorated the participation. And those who wanted also received a physical copy of the book. Again, this was to not only be appreciative of their time and the value of their insights, but also to close the loop where you're not just here to talk to us and provide information, but we're also here to want to tell you what happened with that information and why it was valuable for us to take the time and speak with one another. This is a picture of the letters and certificates that were sent out to participants. I know that Sarah Sullivan was very much involved in this process, so I don't know if you want to jump in here. I know that Bobby was also involved in this process, so I'll open the floor to you.
Sure. Maybe I'll just chime in, and then Sixto, if you have anything you want to add about the compensation piece. I'll just say we really did try to one of Sarah's recent points to really close the loop where we could, and as a way of thinking about the way we were relating to the participants is that they were we tried to have them be the first to know what was happening with the report. So like this comes a little bit later, but I think is in the spirit of this conversation. Like on the day of launch, on the day of launch when we met with press, the day before that, we had all the same leadership we were putting in front of the press actually meet with young people the day before launch, and they were the first to know, the participants, they were the first to know what we were going to say before press the next day. So we just tried to really anticipate moments like that. And we knew, like, we tried to, these gifts, these tokens of appreciation that went out, they went out prior to launch. And the idea was, you know, it might not feel very good if you feel like you poured your heart and soul into help making a project public, and then when it launches, nobody's giving you a tap on the shoulder, no one's saying good job. Like, we really wanted to prevent that experience. And so we made sure we had a call for you the day before launch, you were getting a token appreciation the day of launch, and that you were really being acknowledged as a part of this process when it launched.
And I think one of the questions that we're seeing in the chat too here is that people are asking, like, hey, compensation was part of this process, and that is too high of a compensation coercive. And I think that that's part of the traditional challenge here, which is I don't really understand why folks would think that, you know, folks who participate in research studies who have different, you know, privileges or may not have the same needs, like a certain amount may mean something to them, but for our young people who were going through this process, valuing their time at this rate was all about actually valuing the unique expertise that they have that other folks literally do not have. And so for me, when I think about this question of, like, did we compensate too high? You know, it's not the question you ask a graphic designer, and not all of us can move, you know, shapes on a screen and make beautiful graphics. And so I struggle with even the question itself and the fact that we have to have an answer for that question. But I'll open it up to my colleagues to see if any of my colleagues want to answer that.
Well, this is a little bit ad hoc, but, you know, when you think if a person were in a car accident, right, and these are just my thoughts, if someone was in a car accident and they have long-term, you know, effects from that car accident, they're going to be compensated based on those long-term effects, right? And so when we're asking young people to bring up some of those traumatic, you know, experiences that they have, we're also compensating them for what may happen after the interview, right? What trauma may resurface 2 days after the interview or a week after the interview, right? And so I don't think the level of compensation is too high, because we're also being thoughtful of the long-term effects of trauma, which is a lifelong healing process, And when we're asking them to resurface that, we're also considering, well, what may come next. Let's be mindful of that and make sure they have some money in their pocket to do some self-care or remedy however they need to. So those are my personal thoughts on that.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. There seems to be a lot of questions around overcompensation and how that in traditional research, and particularly research that has to go through IRB, Institutional Review Board reviews, high compensations are equated to coercion. And I think we're starting to see some critique around the ethical dimensions of offering payment to research participants. And I'm happy to share some resources around that, where we understand that the various laws, regulations, and ethical guidelines that govern the conduct of research offer very little in terms of specific guidance around what are acceptable offers of payment. So it's not surprising that it leads to overprotection and possibly distracting from things that we should actually be worried about, which is that maybe our offers are too low. Okay, let's move on to the 7th step, which is how we validated the findings from the research. And we did that through 2 ways. The first one was by going back to the participants that took part of the study. And we invited them to basically correct, nuance, react to what we heard, what we wrote, as well as offer them options for what we should do with that data next. 44 out of the initial 78 participants participated in this review, the majority of whom supported the findings and recommendations, and absolutely all of whom added a lot of much needed nuance to the findings, which were then incorporated in the final report that was published. This was a Google form that we sent to participants where they could go through a summary of the findings section by section. And they were asked whether it was representative of their experience, if they agreed with the framing, if they had anything to add. And if they wanted to know more, we also provided a link to the draft report and a video with some of the team members explaining the findings. So they could have both a summary as well as a longer sort of text and a video, so they could choose the format that they preferred to absorb the information around the findings. The second way that we did that was by forming a lived expert review board. So this was a board of 5 people, some of whom you're going to hear from in the panel after this presentation. And these people had lived experience in foster care and professional experience in child welfare. We invited them to read and review the report, to support us in the framing of the recommendations from the study, to provide guidance on how to incorporate those comments that we received from the participants, and decide on how to disseminate the study's findings, including from the get-go whether this was something that should be published or not. So all 5 members of this review board were asked, is this actually worth putting out in the world or not? And just a quick note, by way of context, both of these reviews were conducted in addition to 2 other peer reviews that were conducted by Child Trends and the Annie E. Casey Foundation. So we had sort of the typical research academic review done, but we really wanted to balance that with more of a lived expert review, as well as one where we went back to the participants that told us their stories to make sure that we were authentic in telling those stories ourselves. This is a snapshot of the draft where we began consolidating all of the comments that we received before we started incorporating them. There were a lot of them, and this is not an overstatement. So we had our work cut out for us to be able to make sure that all of the feedback was incorporated, but it was well worth it because I think the report was all so much better after this peer review process. So I'd like to pause here. Any thoughts or additions from my colleagues?
I'll chime in with some thoughts at first, which is I think some of the moments of the project that were I think we collectively as a group are most proud of are right here. I think we had some creativity here that we feel excited about and proud of. And one element of that was the participant review, which Sarah just said, where we went back to the 78 young people and put the draft in front of them. But we even tried to design that in a way that would be the most accessible. By that point, the draft was 120 pages. Obviously, some young people would read it, but we knew it would be a lower bar, that would be a high bar for a lot of young people to get over, even if they were fairly compensated. So we really tried to think critically about how could we put this information in front of them in the way that could get the most substantive feedback. And so even just the design of that participant review, I think I feel proud of. We basically they got to see all of the findings and all of the recommendations, but the way we did it is by breaking it up where we had one slide per chapter, basically. And so that way everyone could just react to the slides. We also gave everybody a shorter version, like a condensed version of the report if they did actually want to do more and read more. And we gave them a link to a 90-minute presentation of all of the material. So if they were one of those people who wanted to engage even more, they had a way to do that. But we tried to really capture as many people engaging as possible, which is why we had 44 of the 78 young people participate in that participant review, which we're told is a very high percentage, and we feel good about that. And this really, really deepened. I can't really overstate how much this deepened the quality of the report. We did a fundamental rewrite between stages 1 and then stages 2, and a lot of the real richness of the report came from this participant review process. And then the second thing we're, I think, so proud of is this lived expert review board, which you're going to hear from Angelique and Eddie, who are members on the panel shortly. And this is where we really wanted to counter some of the traditional exercises that happen in a peer review process and say, look, if we've centered lived experience this far in the project, how can we center lived experience in the validation and the legitimizing of the findings? And so we created this lived expert review board where we selected 5 experts or subject matter experts in child welfare who also themselves had lived experience in foster care, and asked them to do a comparable peer review. And then just the last thing I'll mention, to Sarah's point, you saw that draft Google Doc where all the comments are side by side. And one of the other elements I think we're excited about is we actually consolidated all the comments from all the reviews, the participant review, the child trends review, the 5 lived expert peer reviews, and we put them all together. And we considered all the comments together. And that way, if there were, counter comments that were opposing, we could actually look at them together in real time rather than saying, okay, we're going to look at the lived experts first, but a traditional academic review is going to get the final say. We wanted to actually reconcile them together. So those are some of the thoughts that I wanted to share.
Thank you so much, Sarah. The final last step is disseminating findings. Before the dissemination, like Sarah mentioned earlier, participants were the first to hear about updates to the project before anything went public. And if you've read the report, you'll notice that it relies heavily on first-person voices through direct quotes, as well as visual and textual artifacts that were submitted directly by young people. And for the national readout of the report, participants were invited to be involved in elaborating and further discussing the material as a group, which allowed the team to incorporate the literal voices of youth discussing what the findings meant for them as part of the readout. As we're coming up on time, I wanted to just invite very quickly, and before I do that, just pause here and be very clear that the methods, approaches, and decisions that we made throughout the research process are not a checklist of things that we're asking the field to replicate. We're not an authority on just research justice. We're not the only people who are doing this, but we wanted to walk you through some of the ways we grappled with the inequities that are typically reproduced in research and how we attempted to minimize them. So consider this presentation more of an invitation to build the critical discernment that we need to center the lived experiences of those who will be most affected by our work. Speaking of invitation, I have 3 in particular. One that is directed at my colleague Sarah S., whom I hope can speak to how we operationalize this study in terms of funding, timeline, getting buy-in. We'll try to keep the answers short as I have 2 additional invitations, and then we can move on to the panel.
Beautiful. I'll just share, how were we able to operationalize this? Well, at a high level, I think the answer is that we didn't consider lived experience as an add-on. We considered it as foundational. And I think a lot of projects we see that can happen in this space sometimes is that you do a research project or you do a project, and at the end you're like, oh shoot, how do we add lived experience? And then, yeah, if you look at it from that standpoint, it might be an additional expense. It might be hard to operationalize, but that's because it wasn't built into the actual framework of the whole project. So for us, like, we had to hire teammates to do this project, and it was just as it costs just as much money to hire someone with lived experience or incorporate some teammates with lived experience as it does other folks. And so that wasn't an additional expense. That was just rooted in the foundation of the project. Or likewise with the peer review, we were going to do peer reviews of the paper, and let's say we had 2 academic peer reviews. And that's a thing we're already going to do. It is just as easy to build into it that say, hey, one of these is going to be a lived expert peer review. And so I think my answer really is to consider lived experience not as an add-on. And when you do that, yeah, that's hard to operationalize and could be more expensive. But when you build it into the foundation of the project, then it's just a part of what you do.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sarah. That is a very important difference in frame that I think was very much the spirit of this whole study and project.
And real tactical, real quick, bring lived experience at the very, very, very beginning. And as you think about the things that need to get scoped, literally when you're pushing out the scope of work, thinking through what is the experience that our folks are having at this moment, and at this moment, but asking folks with lived experience, saying, okay, what usually doesn't feel good about that one touch point in an interview? What does feel great about those things? And that will help you outline for you to say, oh, okay, I have enough here. You have to have that relationship with, obviously people to even share that level of information, but there is a pathway that you could be creating.
Yeah, thank you, Sixto. My second invitation is to my colleague, Bobby, whom I'm hoping can provide her perspective as someone sort of at the Venn diagram intersection between being someone with lived experience and being a part of the research team, and how that felt for you.
Yeah, it was transformational for me to be a person with lived experience in many congregate care settings. It really was a healing type of experience, because I got to understand that, through the system experience that I had, it wasn't just me, right? It wasn't just me, but in that time when I was so young, I did feel like it was just me, or just the couple of peers that were around me, right? And so having that shared experience, it made me realize it was the system. But furthermore, that was a very personal experience. To furthermore on that point, I really think it was about being a researcher, being able to go through the process as a researcher. And
Oh no, I think we may have lost Bobby. Or is it just me?
She's dropped for me too.
Okay, well, for the sake of time, I think we might want to move on, but I will admit to everybody who's listening and who's joined us today that Bobby was so critical to the entire process and challenged us in so many different ways, from the very first moment where we were framing questions to the very last moment when we were writing the report. And so having someone really be a part of the decision-making of everything related to the study that was so close to the topic and so close to that lived experience was extremely valuable. So as someone who was looking in, I could not thank Bobby and other colleagues more for the way that they really challenged us and pushed us to do better. And the last invitation, and this is just to transition us off to the panel, I'd love to hear from everybody who's going to be in the panel if they've found other ways to center lived experience that we haven't thought of, which ones worked, which ones didn't, but also what ways claim to be centering lived experience but are merely tokenizing. And with that, pass it on to Sixto for the panel portion. But thank you so much for listening into the presentation. I don't know if that's the case for everybody, but Sixto, I can't hear your voice.
Thank you. By this time, we would have learned how to use the mute button, but we all need good freshers and reminders sometimes. So sorry about that, folks. So one, I'm so excited. Thank you, Sarah F. As I was saying before, I'm going to go ahead and bring up all of our panelists. And we're going to kick off our panelists here with the simple question of who are we? And excuse me, to tell folks sorry, I got distracted by the muting. I would love for each of the panelists to actually introduce themselves. And we can go off with Alyssa.
Sorry, also got turned around with the mute button there. Hi, everyone. I am so excited and honored to be here with you all today. My name is Alyssa Lear, and I'm a research analyst in child welfare at Child Trends.
And Brian?
Oh, there we go. I am Brian Samuels. I'm the executive director at Chapin Hall. Chapin Hall is a research institute at the University of Chicago. And before that, I had a variety of public policy leadership positions. So I was the child welfare director for the state of Illinois. I was also the federal leader for child welfare during the Obama administration. So have been around child welfare for the better part of the last 25 years, and glad to be a part of the discussion.
Awesome. And Angelique?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Angelique Day. I'm an associate professor in the School of Social Work at the University of Washington and the federal policy lead for Partners for Our Children, which is affiliated with the university. And I also served as a lived expert panel reviewer for the Away from Home study.
Awesome. And Eddie?
Hello, everybody. I'm Eddie Vanderwalk. I am also a member of the Lived Expert Panel Review Board. And in my full-time job, I serve as a facilitator of family outreach for 2 schools that are located in Urbandale, Iowa.
Awesome. So I want to kick off by getting some of your immediate reactions to the methodology in this presentation. How is the methodology similar or different from qualitative studies that you may have conducted in the past, participated in the past? And so I want to start off with that question there.
You want a certain person to react to first, or?
Feel free to jump in.
All right. I have a few different things, so cut me off if I'm taking too much time. So there's so much about this study that I was excited about, and I am assuming I'm not the only researcher geeking out on this call right now. But just a few things I want to mention. So the Bill of Rights, I love the idea that you framed in informed consent around the Bill of Rights. It's a particular idea that is foster youth derived and is grounded in youth voice, and Bill of Rights is something that many foster youth across many states have been asking for legislatively. So it's really nice to ground this study using terminology that is youth voice driven. So the idea of using the Bill of Rights for informed consent, I thought was genius. The next area that really jumped out at me was the trauma training that you required all the researchers to have. Typically in university-based research, their IRB requires researchers to create like a resource and referral list of mental health agencies when there's a risk of a trauma trigger during research. But the limitation of resource and referral is typically researchers don't follow up to see if the participants actually used that type of resource. So the fact that you ensured that all of the members of the research team were grounded in trauma and were able to manage that as it unfolded during the research process, again, rare, innovative, and ingenious. I also wanted to, there was a lot of conversation around compensation. I think you all might be trailblazing in terms of starting this university-based conversation on what is appropriate compensation. I saw there was a lot of things going in the chat, and IRBs are concerned absolutely with this idea of overcompensation as coercive. And I think there's some retraining that needs to happen because we don't blink an eye at providing a $500 or even $1,000 honorarium for inviting our colleagues to present and share information at an invited talk at a university. But the fact that an IRB really looks at over $100 compensation as raising a red flag. So it's just this idea of our universities might be actually creating a new kind of ism where it's okay to pay those rates to degreed professionals, but not to our young people. So I think this is a great point of future conversation. I have two more points, and I promise I'll be quiet. The next thing that I thought really stood out in this particular presentation that many researchers could learn from is your member checking process. As Sarah indicated in her talk, the number of folks recruited to participate in member checking was unbelievably high, and member checking is not done in all qualitative studies, and if it is, and it has been acknowledged as a strength even in traditional research, but typically if you have 2 to 3 people in a study participate in member checking, that's considered good. But the fact that you had so many and that you provided multiple methods for an opportunity for engagement and member checking, again, super unique, innovative, and genius. I'm going to say that word a lot here. My final piece I wanted to bring up in terms of how this was done is the strategy for dissemination. And I could absolutely see, the Indigenous framework in the dissemination that you discussed today, this idea of respecting participants and sharing information with them first. This is something we should be doing in any community-based project. Many researchers go into community and they take information and they don't share back. It's unfortunately super common. And the idea of being intentional about sharing back with community first is a concept grounded in Indigenous methods framework, and it absolutely is a best practice that should be applied in all types of research, and that we do need to stop the practice of taking without giving back to community.
Angelique, thank you so much for those comments. I want to open it up and see if Alyssa or Eddie or Brian, if you had any thoughts before I go on to the next question. And just want to acknowledge that there are more questions around compensation and coercion. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and flag some of these and try to work them into the end of this panel so that we give the audience a bit of time for the questions that they have. So would love to see if anyone else has some thoughts on this question here.
So I think the work that you did here from top to bottom was so thoughtful and at the same time really disciplined and deliberate about all aspects of the work. So I think at Chapin it's not uncommon when doing our qualitative work that we would work with many of the people that we're interested in interviewing and engaging during the design process to get input and feedback from them. It's not uncommon for us to develop questions and test those questions and get feedback from the target audience around the design of questions and making sure that the language is accessible and that people are really answering the question that you think you're asking. And it's certainly not uncommon to be able to, once that data collection has been completed, to be able to go back to young people and share the findings from those interviews as well as some of the recommendations. But usually that's where the work stops. And so your efforts to push well beyond that, to be able to actually, after those recommendations have been developed and the entire document has been written, to give the opportunity for the folks with lived experience to have the same kind of status and opportunity to review the full document and to give their specific feedback, I think is really powerful. And I don't think there are any examples that I can point at Chapin during the last 8 years that I've been there, where that late in the process, we've been able to engage in a very comprehensive and deliberate way of engaging young people, to make sure not that we got the findings right, not that we got the recommendations right, but we accurately captured the totality of what was shared with us, and to make sure that it's representative of the perspective of the folks that were interviewed, I think is really powerful and makes this work very unique. Now, admittedly, most of the folks at Chapin on the research side would ask me to pause and acknowledge that to do that, it takes more resources and it takes more time. But I think everybody here today, or anybody who's had a chance to read the report, certainly can see the real value add to what your process was able to accomplish. And so sure, there may be trade-offs between getting more detailed feedback and completing the document a month earlier. But the return on investment here seems to be pretty high. And there are certainly projects going forward where this kind of approach ought to be considered, a top shelf approach. And there should be expectations that folks give serious consideration across the entire methodology that you put forward here. So I say kudos to everybody involved.
I want to say thank you so much for that. We actually took one very big, scary step when we put the lived experience review board. There was this moment where we had a critical review from researchers instead of a foundation. Then we had a third party, Child Trends, do an independent peer review. And then we were like, wait a second. The power dynamic here was that, once again, there was these institutions that got to kind of tell us yay or nay, right? And so we were like, oh, what's missing from this process? And what was missing it was, in our opinion, was to actually put the publishing power in the hands of folks with lived experience. And when I tell you, we were scared to God and scared of our funder, if the lived experience review board would have came back and said, no, you cannot publish. But we made that leap of faith, that we had did our homework, that we had followed process, that we had did everything that we could do. In addition to doing the very valuable academic, tradition of getting a peer review, getting a critical review, but saying that the end power should be in young people's, not young people, but lived experience hand. And we structured the lived experience board to actually be a composition of folks who had aged out, to folks who have had a career in actually conducting research and have a PhD. And that was intentional, because we believe that different points of your life, you have different reflections and different insights. And so to be able to actually have folks with the full value of lived experience, it's not just to go ahead and engage young people. It's the spectrum of folks who have had all the intersecting experiences there too. Alyssa, before I move on, I just wanted to make sure you didn't have something that you wanted to add to this point here.
No, I would just echo what Brian and Angelique touched on. I think my immediate reaction every time I come back to it is really feeling inspired in the depths of thought of everything from the consent to the trauma-informed care and compensation pieces, and everything you just touched on, I think just really spoke to treating these young people with the value that they deserve to be treated with. And the value of having researchers with that lived experience is a part of every step of this process, I think was an incredible feat.
Thank you. So I want to go ahead to the next question here, which was, what is the benefit of doing qualitative studies? And the reason why we have this question is because we've gotten this a lot from folks, that there have been quantitative studies, right, around group home and institutionalization, institutional care. And one of the things that we saw that was missing from the conversation is what the actual people who were in it really do believe, what was their actual experiences from their voices, right? Not from the administrative data, not from these other data sets, but what is the value of qualitative study? And specifically, the reason I ask this is because I feel like there's a tension that even on this webinar we've been seeing, is like, do we value voice enough to have the same standing as quantitative method and quantitative research?
So, you know, at least for the 25 years that I've been involved in child welfare, quantitative studies have certainly been held in higher esteem. It's certainly the case because there is so much administrative data and access to administrative data. It's often the preferred way to go at learning and knowing whether the policies and practices we're engaged in are making a difference. But admittedly, it's only one way of knowing. And my wife, who is a well-respected qualitative researcher in child welfare, if she were here, could make a very compelling argument that the power of knowing through qualitative studies are as powerful as that which one can gain from quantitative studies. And she could give you the same set of citations to support her argument as the quantitative folks will surely send my way. But there's tremendous power in qualitative work done with the same level of discipline, using the same deliberate steps in a process, the sifting and sorting and organizing and interpreting done through well-coded interviews. There's tremendous power here, and it would be a mistake for most, if not all people, to assume that a qualitative study of 75 or 100 young people is somehow less valuable than a quantitative study that included administrative data from 1,000 people. It's just they're tools. They should be used where they have the greatest value, and when done right, quantitative and qualitative studies can stand on par with one another. And in many instances, they are great complements to one another. There are things you can know through quantitative studies that you may not have access to through qualitative studies. But there's also insights gained in qualitative studies that just aren't with quantitative methods. And so it ultimately comes down to the quality and the discipline of the work, but no one should diminish these findings simply because they have the descriptor of qualitative methods associated with them.
Thank you so much, Brian, for that. One of the things that just come to me, and I just can't help but name, is that when we look at our country's history and how we constructed our society and the drivers that we have around power dynamics, it's part of our fabric in this country and this society that we have undervalued certain people's voices, right? And the people who get studied tend to be folks who what? Maybe are not the ones who are in the position to do the studying all of the time. And so when I think of race, when I think of sexual orientation, when I think of gender, and expression and identity, the folks who are being studied and who narratives are being written about, sometimes there's, I feel like, a question around the value of their voice in general society. So imagine the how we are valuing qualitative studies. And I do think that there's so much that gets surfaced here by the current structures that be around, okay, why qualitative versus quantitative? Why payment? You know, are we paying too much? Are we paying enough? Are we paying too little? Are we paying too high? Right. So when I think about this specific argument of qualitative versus quantitative, I just get the feeling that there's something deeply rooted way down the line that it just continues to surface. And this is part of the structural kind of racism, the structural classism, and so forth that we see. But that's just my opinion, and I'm not a researcher, but those are some of the opinions I like to just put out. I want to make sure I make space for anyone else who wanted to answer that before I move on to the next question. Angelique? And Angelique, I think you're on mute.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay, awesome. So just to add to what Brian was saying in terms of the deeper level of understanding concepts, that's a strength of qualitative data, is that in a lot of quantitative data, there are certain populations who are left out. So for example, I know there's a few of us on the call that do research in tribal communities. And if you look at many administrative data, you know, they dichotomize, you know, BIPOC versus white or Black versus white. So these smaller populations do not have a voice, and that the qualitative inquiry is one of the few mechanisms where that voice can happen. So it's important for us to understand the power of qualitative research for those that are represented in the community in much smaller numbers. And the other powerfulness of qualitative research that we haven't talked about yet is that in qualitative inquiry, when you're designing protocols in community, it is the participants who drive the story as that discussion unfolds rather than the researcher. And in quantitative research, we make assumptions that we kind of know what we want to ask and we know what responses we're looking for, in that it's checkbox or some other type of quantitative methodology. And in qualitative, it's really the participant that guides the conversation and interprets that question any way they want, and they have the freedom to do that, and that it just allows for an understanding of a concept that just can't be done quantitatively.
I will add, as an admitted quantitative nerd most of the time, that I think there is so much value in having a study like this stand on its own and really serve as the foundation and context for future studies rather than having to be secondary to quantitative pieces. I think that when we're formulating what questions are we asking, what analyses are we doing, who's interpreting that information, I think so much of the context and foundation has to come from what youth are saying and what is captured in reports like this, that I think it is monumentally important that qualitative research is a part of it. And I think that is really, in combination with quantitative research, the only way that we can center youth voice in quant work is to capture some of these pieces.
I love the fact that I'm starting to hear even like these tension points arise. And so one of my questions then is like, what does centering lived experience present as tension points in conducting the research? How do we work through those differences or nuances in experiences and opinions? How do we make sense of all that? Eddie, I think do you have something? I see you leaning in and just don't want to misinterpret that.
Yeah. No, I have thoughts. I just, I echo a lot of what my colleagues are saying here, but I think that was one of the pieces of my experience as a lived expert panel reviewer that came up, because I was positioned with other individuals who have lived experiences, but also that are different than mine, and also their professional careers were informing their perspectives and their feedback. And additionally, we were taking in the experiences and lives of others. So like all of those ingredients into that definitely brought up some tensions in the review, in the discussion, and even in the few times, that the team came back to us and lifted up the tough questions and really elevated those themes and experiences that came up, and also the methodology at times. There was chance that some of that could bring forth tensions. And a lot of times we all agreed upon the methodology and agreed upon the meaning that was made from that. But there are times where our experiences were, not reflective of what we were discovering, and we had to work through that. And we had to really lean in and listen, and we had to make sure that a number of things weren't being projected onto the research and weren't being brought into a space that that was kind of not aligning with the goal and with the integrity of the research and of the study. And the ways you work through that is you just, you name them and you sit with them in transparency, and you really hold them at a level of significance, but also like you keep centering the goal, you keep centering the young people, the story, the mission of everything. But you also have to plan and prepare for those. And I think at times, like, we weren't prepared for some of that feedback and some of that discussion and just some of that, like, those rubbing points of the dialogue that we had. But to completely minimize it or be passive about it or discard it would also impact the integrity of the research and the review, and then the steps that it took forward. And so I think those tensions are often overlooked and not sat with regularly, and not also we're not taking the time to draw meaning from that and to learn from that and to provide that space for those that were engaging even after these points of contact. So I think there's a lot there, but I think the point is that we sit with them and we don't dismiss them or minimize them or put them aside in the name of research or study or, all those other technical terms. So,
I mean, so much of what you're hitting on, Eddie, has to do with a huge core part of the process of qualitative studies, which is the meaning making. Who gets to look at it? Who gets to filter the information and to then make inferences on this, and the lens by which those meanings are being made. So for me, I want to start off with you, Angelique, on this one. Like, why is it important to have people with lived experience in making meaning? And when I say lived experience, I want folks to be thinking not just current foster youth, not just youth who are in their 18, 20-year-olds, but the entire spectrum of lived experience. Angelique, any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I have a lot of opinions on this. As my foster case was in Michigan back in the 90s. And I remember a point, because I was engaged in policy at a pretty young age, of having my voice be valuable. And then I turned 24, and then people stopped calling me or caring about what I had to say at that point. But I felt like as I got older, I learned more. I was better at understanding policy, and I felt like I could actually offer more when I was older, but not given the opportunity to do that. I definitely value and appreciate an opportunity of being, an old person, being able to still be able to use that lens and have that lens respected. I'd love just to call out, if we have any state folks on here, that there is value in engaging young people after they age out of Jim Casey or any other project that might be specific to the state, in that, you have a lot to offer. And, as I aged, I had the opportunity of being a professional practitioner to work as a lobbyist in a policy space. So being able to bring that lens in more ways, and being able to look at research, both from a lived experience lens, a policy lens, a practitioner lens, really enhances those interpretations. So hoping that folks on this call can see that and value that. I know there's a lot of older alumni that are listening in, so I got your back, all those people out there.
Well, I have to admit, reading the report was actually it was difficult for me for this reason. While I never spent time in the child welfare system, I did grow up in a home with a single mom who had been exposed to a lot of trauma in her life. Ultimately, had substance abuse and mental health issues. And as part of a kind of family intervention to try to help my mom get her life together, I was placed at a boarding school for kids from broken homes, and was placed there when I was 7. The expectation was, in a year or so, my mom would be able to figure things out, and I'd be able to go back home, and things would go back to the way they should have been. And I ended up leaving the school when I was 18 and a half years old. So I grew up in a residential program, and so I had a hard time reading the study and not wanting to try to compare the experiences of young people with my own experience. But I raised that for not a personal reason, but a professional one, which is that we all use filters to understand the world, and one of the important filters that we carry with us is our childhood. But as Angelique said, as we then grow out and have other experiences, the sifting and sorting of and making of meaning changes across time. And so I think there is real value in having the perspective of folks who have had that experience with close proximity versus those that have had some distance from it and have a little bit more perspective from which to make meaning of things. And so I do think that an important part of the work that was done here was that intentional effort to create a space where meaning could be made through discussion and sharing of ideas and pushing back and forth. I think that was critical. I think if you were going to write another report, I'd argue that meaning making process could even be amplified more, just in terms of how one thinks about doing that, because that is the translational aspect of moving from a pile of data that's sitting on a table nicely organized to a recommendation about what we do about things, right? And that process could end up going a lot of different ways, again, depending on the people that are around the table, depending on how close or how far away from their own experiences they sit, as well as all of the other experiences they've had since their experience in a residential program. So I think the meaning making is at the heart of research, especially qualitative research these days in child welfare. And so this is where I think the work, all of your work on this one gets you an A+, because there's real value there. But being able to talk about and think about and share your feelings and experiences around the meaning making process, I think is really critical, because I think it really, you guys went far beyond what most folks would do. Most researchers would have the resources or expertise to do. But there's such great value there. And again, I just share my story as one way of reminding that we all have lived experiences, and it's often hard to separate those experiences from our professional ones as we get into the process of making meaning of things. And the more transparent we are about that sifting process, the more we're willing to acknowledge that there are competing interests here as we try to make sense of things. I think the more genuine the work is, and across time, certainly a way of getting a higher quality product consistently. So I think there's real value in there, and I hope folks won't skip over the making meaning process and just go straight to what the recommendations are from the report.
You know, Brian, I really appreciate that. And one of the things that this triggers for me is that Brian Stevenson, in his work around proximity, if you watch the Just Mercy movie, talks about the fact that in order to be effective problem solvers, we have to understand the nuances of people's experience so that we can then really be in a position to be understanding the problem, scoping to the right problem, then providing solutions and interventions that can aim at that. We're 4 minutes out, but I want to give each panelist about 30 seconds to really just give us just your last thought, your last words. And I just want to thank the audience for being so engaging. I see the YouTube chat. You all have been going on. I feel like there's a lot more work for us to go ahead and put some links together for you all of everything that you've requested. But I just want to go ahead and kick it off with Eddie, and we'll go through and just, if you can give us 30 seconds of your last thought as we begin to close out here.
Yeah, I think the most profound thing that's sitting with me that I just want to offer is that the level of care and accountability and genuine concern and integrity that went into the process of this, I think should be replicated over and over and over. And any time that we engage young people, adults, anyone with lived experiences in the extraction of their story, and that it's cherished and that it's valued and that it's respected. And I think this report, reflects that in so many ways, but I would love to see that applied in all of our engagement. I serve students right now, and I feel moved and even more deeply inspired to engage with them in that way every single chance that I get, because some days they are a number and some days they are a survey that we collect, but every day they're human. And that's what I have to center every time. And I think I have so many other thoughts, but that's just what I want to leave the audience with in that space.
Alyssa?
It is a bit of my soapbox, as I'm sure some of my colleagues can attest, but I think the real thing I would emphasize, what really has struck me throughout this whole process, is that I think sharing power looks like having people with lived experience as a part of research teams and at every level of our organizations. And we need to continue to carve out that space and be really intentional about how we value and support folks who want to do this work and other professionals in doing the work with that lived experience lens, and continue doing the work towards changing systems that impacted them. The voices of young people on youth advisory boards and in participatory research are so important, but I think at the same time, as we're elevating those voices, we also need to go beyond that and truly share power with folks with lived experience at every level of organizations and projects in order to truly center youth voice.
Angelique?
Yeah, I would just like to say in summary, I think what I'm hoping folks are taking home today is that we all need to be thinking about those with lived experience as not just in the role of research subject, but that we strive to make it a regular practice to include lived experience in survey and protocol development, co-creating codes and data analysis and interpretation, and understanding that this particular knowledge is valuable, it is worth something, and we need to be pushing and having conversations with our IRB, our research offices, in terms of this compensation conversation. It's been a hot topic, and I hope that it doesn't end here. And I want to challenge everyone who works in university on this call to take that step. To finally, one other thing we hadn't talked about today is that, in terms of dissemination, taking the step beyond, not just reporting back to community, but including your community as authors on any pieces that are disseminated. And I hope that we will all see, when we see lived experience as co-authors, that actually adds authenticity and reliability. And you can feel more confident in the results of that data because they were there and they were a part of it.
Brian?
I just say that you guys have a ton to be proud about here, and that like anything, when you hand over power and control, you never know where people are going to go with it and what they do with it. And instead of deciding you were just going to go off and do your own thing, what you instead tried to do was to model Class A behavior, right? That you decided that you were going to design as rigorous a study as you could, and that you were going to live out all the essential principles of how the work should be done. And more than just saying that you wanted to do that, you went and did it. And I think you deserve a great deal of credit for that. And I hope that others will follow your lead and hold themselves to the same standard that you did. So kudos to everybody involved in the work.
Well, such mic drops, everyone, and such gratefulness, and we're so thankful for your participation here. I want to just say thank you to the audience who tuned in, the audience who were excited about the report, and there were audience members who came because they wanted to learn more because they had a different opinion of this report. And we welcome those conversations, and we welcome you to our table to continue to dialogue and have conversations so that we could have even deeper and deeper understanding of these topics that we are working on. With that being said, thank you everyone for tuning in. We'll continue to be in communication. We'll continue to have conversations specifically on the topic, but also on the topic of how do we continue to center lived experience and really flip the power dynamics in the current status quo of how we conduct research. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the panelists, and thank you to the team and to the young people and to the lived experience folks who worked on this project.